I wanted to get this started relatively on time also for their benefit. So once again, thank you all for coming out today. My name's John Lindsay. I work here at FHI 360 as part of the Workforce Connections Project. And what we are hoping to do today with this event is have more of an open discussion among the different community members, the different stakeholders, among the community of practice, and all those people who are really interested and really concerned about young people and what the outcomes are going to be for young people's lives in the near and in the longer term. And that's why we're really here today. And I'd like to make sure we keep that all in mind as we're doing this today. So as I said, I work for the Workforce Connections Project. Workforce Connections is funded by the E3 Department of USAID, and we're really involved in trying to promote evidence-based learning, promote capacity building, and also promote an open space for stakeholders around issues of workforce development, which is a very wide and wide-ranging topic. So what we have here today is we have a discussion, and I wanted to do brief introductions and then turn it over to what is the meat of this session today. Like I said, my name is John Lindsay. I'm with FHI 360. Our moderator today is Alec Hansen. He's also with Workforce Connections here at FHI 360. Unfortunately, one of our panelists got sick today and she could not make it. So Nancy Guerra will not be presenting today. But we hope at a later date we can bring her down here and we can, present some of her information to the community as well. So who we have with us today on the far right is Susan Cruz. And then here we have Amy Crawford. I'd like to give them all a chance to introduce themselves because I think they could do a better job than I could do that myself. So let me pass it along here. Intro, sorry.
So I'm Alec Hansen. I've been asked to moderate, I think probably because I'm far from an expert on youth violence. I'm an economist who's worked a lot in Latin America, so I've seen a lot of the violence, like a lot of us have, and I've been puzzling about it. I've been working on the Workforce Connections Project for almost a year, and we've seen a lot of, in Kenya and Zimbabwe, a lot of efforts to take youth who've been involved in violence, even those who've had PTSD or what have you, what approaches are needed to try to get them back in the workforce and so on. So like I say, people have been puzzling on it, but here are two experts, and I look forward to hearing from them.
Good afternoon. I'm Amy Crawford. I work at the National Network for Safe Communities. We do applied research in the field, which includes trying to help cities around the United States and some internationally, but largely in the United States, reduce their violence in terms of homicides and shootings. And I'll talk to you about the actual interventions that we use and how that might relate to the conversation today.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Susan Cruz. I and some friends of mine founded an organization called Sin Fronteras, which means no boundaries, to address the issue of kids who were systems involved in Los Angeles County, California. All of us are volunteers and all of us have day jobs. My day job is I work at the Public Defender Service here in DC. I'm a licensed therapist and my background is in social work and public health.
Thank you very much. And for those of you online, just to let you know, we have quite a packed house today, and there's a lot of people here. And while I don't necessarily love putting people on the spot, I would like to take a little snapshot of why some of the people who are here today did come today. So I know that people who are sitting up front are the ones with the strong spirit and are bold enough to sit up front. So just really quick, I'd like to go across these organizations you're from, and then why you came here today. So if you don't mind, I'm going to put you all on the spot.
Hi, I'm Lisa Rook, and I work at DAI in the Latin America division. And I'm here today with some of my colleagues because we are really committed to the Central America region and Caribbean as well, and working on some of these youth crime and violence issues.
And I'm Christy Olenek. I work with Lisa at DAI. I'm in our technical services area, work in youth and workforce development. So like Alec, kind of puzzling over this connection between youth employment and crime and violence prevention.
Hi, my name is Katie Appel, and I'm on the Youth and Economic Empowerment team at Plan International USA. And Plan has a really strong presence in Latin America, and especially in the Northern Triangle. We have a strong youth economic empowerment program in El Salvador. And so we're just here to learn more and excited to be here.
Thanks. I'm John Kurtz with Mercy Corps. For the record, this was the last seat in the House. That's why I'm up here. But we have done a number of studies on looking at the intersection between youth employment or unemployment and violence, mostly outside of Latin America, so Sub-Saharan Africa, Middle East, Asia, and so I'm interested to hear perspectives from the region here. Thanks.
Great, thank you all. And before we turn it over to our presenters, I'd like to give the floor for a minute to Karen Towers from USAID to provide that perspective.
Hi, my name is Karen Towers. I'm the education team leader in the Latin America Bureau at USAID. I also want to recognize Rachel Blum and Nina, who are here from the Office of Education, which supports the Workforce Connections project with FHI 360. I kind of wanted to give some context of why USAID is interested in this particular topic from the point of view of the Latin America Bureau. As many of you know, this year more than 50,000 unaccompanied children came to the U.S. Looking for opportunities, and this ranged from children who are 3 years old all the way up to teenagers to young adults who chose to take that journey, which is really dangerous, as we all know, for many different reasons. That spike is a warning sign that the problems in Central America are getting worse, and that violence and lack of opportunity are two of the most important drivers that we as development professionals need to look at. I think we're seeing the U.S. government look and really pay attention to Latin America right now, especially to Central America. It hasn't gotten a lot of attention or funding in the past, not compared to other regions. And I think we have an opportunity to really look at how do we use that money to look at the underlying causes of why we have these problems. And as I said, you know, we need to adequately address the issues. We have 60% of youth are not attending secondary school. The dropout rates in primary are huge. 1 in 4 youth cannot find a job. And so this idea of looking at youth employment as perhaps one of the program areas where we can look at to engage youth, both as a way to find a job, but also maybe as a way to transition back into education. And then also looking at the link between giving them that opportunity and the fact that perhaps that will give them an incentive not to join a gang or you know, other things that might lead them down the road of violence. And so we're very interested in the panel today to hear from experts who are working in this field, both in the US and in the region itself, and interested to learn more from all of you as well in terms of what you're doing, because I think this is an important area.
Thank you. So I think as John already found from the front row of our group, we have a very diverse group today. And I think that the information we're going to be getting from a few experts will already turn some things upside down for us. In preparing for this, I had found a study from Science, the Science Journal, that in December, there was a study released that showed that summer programs could significantly reduce violence in Chicago. And so I thought, wow, that's great evidence for exactly what we're talking about today. And then she was ready, you know, just popped my bubble just before as we were chatting about how that's a very specific context and all the other studies have found just the opposite. And so, you know, there's a lot of nuance here to what's going on. I think for many of us, we're involved directly or indirectly in designing or implementing programs that on paper might work very well, or they might work again in the US and aren't working in other countries, and why. Very often it's some of this other context about what I've run into is a lot of problems with sexual reproductive health and violence in areas. A girl who has gotten pregnant or been married at the age of 14, her experience is going to be now immediately completely different, and it's still something you can address, but now you have to be aware that you need childcare, you need what have you to make it work. In Central America, the violence is looking different than it is in Central Africa and other places. So I think really looking at what's going on, the flavor of what's happening there, and what we can do about it. Even where we don't have really solid data points, I think the power of a really interesting framework can be helpful to us. So a framework where you haven't filled in the data points, but we can just say, here's a context that we need to be aware of. I'd like to, if we have another slide up there, to show an example within the Workforce Connections project of how we tried to use a framework of not just looking at the supply side of skills development and workforce development, but also to look at the demand side. So here is a value chain map for the dairy industry in Kenya. On the left-hand side is the formal milk channel, on the right-hand side is informal, that is unpasteurized milk, which is 80% of the milk there. And what we tried to do is to put sort of an overlay on this. You'll see 10 little arrows in there, which are entry points for youth. So by taking the value chain and interviewing people in there and saying, you know, where can youth come in and what sorts of background do they need? In some of these jobs, they actually need a university degree or 2 years of post-secondary, but for some of them, even less than a secondary diploma, all the little yellow ones that you see there. So just having this kind of a framework can be very helpful for people that are designing projects, because it gives them a little bit more granularity to what's going on and where employers are saying we could actually be hiring people. I think another interesting example we had, which was also an example of not just looking at the supply side, you know, how do we improve education or training, but also what's happening on the demand side, was where you had programs that were trying to do job placement, and we've seen some of those work and some of them not work, and we always wonder why are they not working, where they're not working. But you see, for example, generally in formal and larger formal sector companies that they can absorb these people and they'll stay for, you know, at least 50% of them will still be employed after a year, whereas in most of the small and medium enterprises, they're lucky if they stay on for 3 months. You have a very small number who are still there after a year. So you sort of wonder, what was this job placement program doing? But what we've seen in a few places is where you actually tie that in with programs that are trying to do upgrading in that particular value chain. So they're working with the enterprise to work on certification or just quality control improvements or marketing, and where then you sort of say, well, if you're going to hire a new person, maybe it can be somebody who's got a quality control degree, maybe just a 2-year degree or something, but somebody who has some experience in marketing, so that that young person, that new employee, is actually almost being paired with the person who's providing technical assistance for that enterprise to try to do the upgrading. So you're coming from the supply side, bringing in trained people at the entry level, but you're also bringing in some technical assistance, which we know how to do in other programs, but we very seldom put those together. So I think, again, that's been a helpful framework within this Workforce Connections project, but it does ignore still the social side that we're looking at, and particularly violence, one of the most difficult problems here. So just with that as a little bit of a perspective, I hope that what will come out of this, if not a lot of hard data points, at least a broadening of our perspectives, a little bit more understanding of the context, and hopefully leading towards frameworks that we can use to address this in Latin America. Thank you. I think we're going to start with Amy, is that right? Oh, thank you. Sorry. There you are.
Oh, thanks. I'll do this. Okay, let's launch that. Okay. So as I said, I work at a place called the National Network for Safe Communities. We're located in New York City at John Jay College of Criminal Justice, and we exclusively focus on trying to find interventions that make communities safer. They are generally addressed to violence, although there are other new kind of innovations that we're doing, but they're largely all directed at trying to reduce violence. We work with cities all over the United States. There's about 60 cities that are doing some form of one or another of our violence prevention work, and we work hand in hand with those cities to try to reduce their violence. And the thing we hear everywhere we go is it's about jobs. It's always about jobs, right? No matter what. I actually was a former public defender many years before, and I used to hear over the 2,000 cases I did, everyone saying the same thing, it's about jobs. And there's also a lot of people, including a very famous a man in LA, Father Boyle, who always says nothing can stop a bullet better than a job. And we all want to believe that. And unfortunately, the research has not actually shown that that's true. And it's complicated, but I'm going to try to help us focus a little bit today, because not only have we struggled with that, we've also come to some new ways of thinking about it ourselves as we try to tackle this issue in the cities that we work in. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how concentrated the violence is. First of all, in the United States, it is highly, highly concentrated in communities that you do not think of necessarily as very dangerous. Of course, there are the Detroits and the New Orleanses, where I was this morning, actually, who's already had 40 homicides this year, and it's not very long, and they have 300,000 people, so you can talk about the concentration in those kinds of cities. We know about those, but it's also very much concentrated in every city, in particular communities, in particular neighborhoods. And these are some just facts out there that can show you what that looks like. The city of Rochester, nobody thinks of, for example, in upstate New York, is particularly dangerous, but when you see where the homicide rate is for particular communities, which are African American and Latino communities, generally you're looking at something about the average of 65 times the national average, and in some places it will go much higher than that even. So in addition to the concentration in the locations, it's also incredibly concentrated in the numbers of people that are involved in the violence. So in every place we've been, and we are waiting for that city to be different, that community that is a smaller jurisdiction, but it always proves out to be exactly the same. And this has also been true internationally in the places that we have done this. It has not been done in hundreds of countries, but we certainly have worked with places as far as Australia and London and parts of South America, that the numbers of people that are driving the violence are very, very small. We go back and look at every city, and it's about, we go back 5 years of homicides, just as a draw the line somewhere, and you'll see less than 1% of the community is driving about 75% of the violence. So when you're thinking about trying to reduce your violence, you have to think about that concentration, about intervening with that very small number of people that are driving the violence. So when you think about trying to do violence prevention, we say that there are traditionally two approaches, right? Law enforcement goes in and does their take down who they think is the most violent group or gang that's driving the violence. And then we have all of the sort of programmatic things that are tackling those large, big questions of education and poverty and jobs and all of that. And I'd like to tell you that some of them, sometimes they work in individual ways, but they don't comprehensively make a difference in violence, not one or the other. Law enforcement ends up running around, going to one place, and then the other one flares up. And as the evidence is unfortunately the case, there aren't that many things that we know will actually reduce violence in terms of the attacking these big social problems. So the group violence intervention was designed in the 1990s back in Boston. It was called, in law enforcement community, everyone calls it the Boston Miracle. It reduced youth homicides by 60% in a very short period of time. And it involved a partnership among law enforcement, the community at large, and the services providers. And because so it would bring in the people that were driving the violence, and there was this three-part communication to them. The first was the violence has to stop, our community won't tolerate the violence anymore, and that was from the community itself, the mothers of murdered sons, people who had lost loved ones, people that had themselves done 20 years and could speak to what violence, their life involved in violence before. There was also the offer of help, and that offer of help was the traditional services that were available in that community, much of which was job programs of some kind, GED or something. And then there was law enforcement, so it was, it was help you if you let us, but we'll stop you if we have to. And that is a very clear message from law enforcement that there would be consequences against not just the individual, but everyone that kind of is involved with that group. Because in addition to the concentration of the small numbers of people, that are driving the violence, those individuals are not solo actors. They are usually operating in small groups of very active criminal offending behavior individuals, and you may not be able to get the entire group for the homicide, but you can get them for something because they are, again, highly active in doing very many things, and so there's a way that you can touch them. So it's not really a program. The first thing we do when we go to cities is say, don't use the P word ever. We will not allow it because that means there's an end to this. And we are not about programs. We're about trying to have you rethink the way you're going to address the problem and do things based on principles and build it out so that it's a new way of thinking of how you're going to address the problems, and each community will tailor it as they see fit. But we don't want it to be something that they think they're going to do for a couple of years and try it out and then stop. So when I say that there was the offer of help, and the reason that we struggle with this as well is that we would go to these, we call them call-ins. We would literally bring in the most active offenders into a room and say, this 3-part message, and one of them was an offer of help. And we would say, here are the, resources available. We kind of knew, the architect of this, among other people, is my boss, and his name is David Kennedy, and we always knew that the facts didn't support that this program was going to actually reduce violence in the community. But there's lots of other reasons you would still want to support community-based efforts of support. That is, it's not fair to say to individuals who are highly, in crisis that there isn't opportunity, right? And we want to give that hope. We want to give them that chance, even if we didn't think that was going to make a huge difference on the violence, or at least it hadn't been proven in the research. But there's also this really strange line that we draw, which is people want to call this carrot and stick, and we say it is absolutely not a carrot and stick, because you should not be saying to people, if you stop killing, we'll give you a job. It should be, stop killing, that's wrong. There's no black and white on that. However, if you want opportunities, they are available for you. That is completely separate. So it's really very much the line we draw is making sure people understand that the violence will stop no matter what. If you don't, you will go and you will be punished for that. But there are opportunities. So we would go to these cities and we would tell them, here's the things that you can offer, consolidate your resources. And in truth, every community would say, oh, we need $1 million to put away for social services. And because everyone is going to want a job and everybody's going to want services. And reality is that very, very, very few people of the core offending population, the people that are actually driving the violence, want services. Sometimes we say they're as angry at the police as they are at social services, and vice versa. They are not they're not necessarily involved in violent behavior because they couldn't get a job. Father Boyle, who I mentioned earlier, also says, that he couldn't do anything for the guy that doesn't want to walk in that door. And so understanding these populations that you're targeting interventions at is very, very important, especially when you're talking about violence. So this just shows you about 10% of the population actually engages in services. We are able to push that up as of late, and I'll tell you how we're working on that. But the number of people, they don't flood the gates, not at least the people that we're talking about in terms of the core population. And in fact, an evaluation of Cincinnati, which does this work, found that it had no impact at all on the violence, even though we were in fact directing our resources completely at the core population, of which, if you could engage, that is where you would see a discernible difference in violence. So these are sort of where we have struggled with it. We have been, for the last 3 years, really focusing and studying on this, bringing experts in around the world who can help us figure out what we need to actually do to make a difference here, because it's not reasonable for us to continue to say, you know, offer them these things, but we don't actually think they're going to make a difference. And the hardest thing has been some of our own helping service providers reframe the way that they think about providing and measuring their success. So traditionally it was how many people can you place in a job? How many people can you get into a drug treatment? And we are so singularly focused on whether or not the homicides and shootings go up or down, and that is what we measure it on, that we are measuring it all on that. We're saying, how do you take these 300 guys who drive 75% of your homicides and shootings and do something to keep them alive and out of jail so they haven't hurt anybody? What does that look like? Because we know that this other structure is not working. So we wanted to change it. That's why we've been working really hard on this. It's really frustrating to go to places and say, you know, that what you're doing is not effective if your goal is reducing violence. And we are so in the business of saying so often to communities, you have to get the violence under control in order to let the rest of the amazing work that communities can do to sustain themselves and blossom. You first have to make it so people are not afraid. That's the first step in really healthy communities. And it's been very frustrating for us, but we really feel like we finally have gotten some ideas of what we can do to go forward. And that's, you know, reframing the idea of keeping these people alive and out of jail and not worrying about these traditional benchmarks of what traditionally social services has been measuring. So, and that is not to say that the things that traditional services, there is going to be a point, hopefully, for all of those that are involved in the most, even the most violent of behavior, will get to a point in which traditional services can latch and be very effective, right? It's not to say that they aren't actually doing wonderful things for lots of people in the community that need them. The problem is it actually being effective at the people that are driving the violence, and how is that going to matter? So here are some examples of the things that we learned after doing this, you know, really surveying all of the cities that we work in, that it wasn't the long-term things. It was a lot of these really small things. One of our service providers said, you know what I think it is? It's the stuff nobody else will pay for. You know, it's these very specific, small, like, I need to get out of this city right now because they're shooting at me or I'm going to shoot at them. And I need a bus pass because my, you know, father lives in Baton Rouge and I live in New Orleans, and and if I go to Baton Rouge,Ll be safe and I might be able to have a job or something along those lines. So it's those very kind of small but immediate, like, crisis things that will help them just get a little bit closer to a stabilized place where traditional things could engage. So we've been working a lot with trying to figure out how to have our service providers give these kinds of non-traditional, I would say, services, things that would address the immediacy of their problems, their fear for, like, literally, I'm going to pick up a gun because somebody else is going to be shooting at me. Some of the core issues of trauma, right, that we know are, you know, some, you know, my boss uses the quote all the time, I like it, that reminds us how much of a war zone these communities are, that in some of these places you had a higher chance of dying in these very, very small communities in terms of concentration of risk than you did in active duty in Afghanistan or Iraq, you know, when you were military. So that is how concentrated the violence is and how much fear there is going on. So these are some samples of things that we've been trying to get people to really think about in terms of providing to those that are involved in the violence. And here are so we've reframed it into these things, right? Sustained relationships, right? Starting with the very small things that will start to build these relationships so that there is an ongoing, very sustained and meaningful relationship that will pull them away from the core group that they're involved in. Offers of hope, than this idea of like they're going to go to another place and fill out another intake form, right? Like that's just not going to work and is not effective for them. Immediacy in terms of the violence and safety, trauma, and just so one of the things that Alec mentioned was a report that came out about Chicago. And a summer youth program that was evaluated by the Chicago Crime Lab. And we are actively involved in Chicago, and the kind of work that we do is very prevalent there. And we were familiar with both the program and were involved in some ways with some of the people that were sent to that program. And it did have great results, you know. And the caveat I was just mentioning was that, you know, it did also, and it's promising because it has a mentoring component, which we think is probably one of the factors that we think we're really pushing and wanting to explore more. And there was a mentoring part of this, but it was also directed at individuals that were already involved in school. And while their violence and arrests went down, first of all, they went down for a limited period, which is good, right? It went down for 16 months, but it then levels off. And the other issue is, were these the drivers of the actual violence in the community, and how concentrated were they? It shows really promising opportunities, but it is one of the very few that actually show an impact in terms of programs. So, you know, it's something we want to continue to look at, but it's not, you know, the magic bullet. It is not, unfortunately. So again, now we have just these kind of main primary goals when we're talking about what we want our community services to do and provide, to say what is, you know, how are you going to wrap these people with whatever services you can possibly give them, which are not going to necessarily be traditional services, to keep them alive and out of jail and therefore not harming other people. And so these are some of the more specific, really, you know, concrete examples of what we're talking about. You know, having somebody available to pick up the phone 24/7, right? That can say, if you don't get me out of here, I'm going to hurt I'm going to hurt someone else, or I'm going to get killed. Really trying to create new communities for them, new relationships, and an opportunity to move towards a more traditional engagement with them, right? So there's an outreach worker specialist who made a comment one time that said, you know, I think it's like we understand that people who are victims of domestic violence may take them 6 times to like leave that abusive relationship, and we understand that it may take 7 times of, you know, trying to be sober if you have an alcohol and addiction to really turn your life around. We ask people in this community to turn their life around in one instant, and then we blame them when it doesn't work, and they are not prepared for the kind of services that we traditionally put at them. They are not ready to get up at 9 o'clock in the morning and go to a job or do a GED program, and setting them up for that kind of failure is not going to help you. Not only is not going to help them individually, it doesn't affect violence. So we want to help people rethink how that is done. And that's where I work. That's what we do. So we'll open up to questions later, I think, right?
If it's all right with you, I'll stand. That way I can see everybody back there. Make sure that you're not falling asleep, you know, that post-lunch coma. All right. So some of my work experience has generally involved getting youth ready for employment, placing them in employment, burning bridges with employers, trying to convince them, to give us yet another opportunity and how we're going to work a lot harder. It is challenging work. I just really want to emphasize something, that Amy touched on. It's about these relationships, and I'll get into not just about the relationships, that you develop, with the youth, but also with employers, with the community, with other service providers. It makes a big difference when you know the face behind the name, and they know also who you are. When you pick up a phone call or you send an email, it makes a huge difference. So this information that I'm going to give you is based a lot of on the work that I've done with youth over a decade and a half. Sin Fronteras is a nonprofit. We've worked with undocumented and accompanied children, for over 15 years. But most of the work that I've done here in the United States, has been with U.S.-born kids. We don't really do workplace development or employment-based services in Central America. A lot of what we do is help youth who are deported back to their homeland to make sure that they have an alternative. Because those of you that work in these countries know that the gang generally tends to be the only reentry program available to them. Most recently, with a collaboration with the University of Maryland School of Law, we put together a informational booklet, and we titled it Unfinished Business, that had everything to do with answering frequently asked questions that deportees had about unfinished business that they left behind in the United States. I've been deported. Can I still do my taxes? Because I worked last year. I've been deported. What's going to happen to my children? I've been deported, or I don't know if I was, if I can go back. How do I do that? So with the assistance of the University of Maryland School of Law, we put together this this brochure, and we've been keeping track of the people that we give information to that contact us, for information. We also do these charlas in El Salvador and in Honduras only, where folks that have been deported come and ask us questions. And given, that I also do work as an expert witness, I get a lot of requests, to provide expert assistance for people that are claiming asylum. And oftentimes these are nonprofits or schools of law that either, cannot pay me, or so we work something out. So I'm able, to get their services to help my clients. So you got to think outside the box. And this is something, that's very important to share, with youth. It's like, how can you get more bang for the buck? How can you be creative about getting things done? And you'd be surprised. Youth are very creative. It's just a matter of, like as Amy said, let's not push the law where it shouldn't be pushed. Also, some of the case studies and some of the things I'll be talking about is going to be predominantly about male youth, but I will touch on some of the specific challenges, barriers, and pluses of working with girls and LGBTQ youth. So, some facts: very young populations. This is the under age 24 in each of these countries. Very young populations, and we generally tend, to sort of, overlook that. When I talk about this, and I'm probably preaching to the choir, but in other places, when I say how young these populations are, people's jaws drop to the ground. It's like, are you kidding? More than half the country? They're kids. And so it's something that's really important to keep in mind, because when you look at the stakeholders, when you look at the decision makers, when you look at the big players, none of them are youth. And so it's very important to try to get youth, to feel like they also have a voice and a vote, because they generally tend to be, used as tokens, or they tend to, be like an afterthought. And even within groups of youth, for example, girls and LGBTQ youth or indigenous youth, they're even more of an afterthought. So it's really important to always keep, it's like, how can I make sure, that we have youth representation, when there are decisions to be made, or when we're considering, doing something in the community. Youth are the most affected by unemployment and underemployment in these countries of any other segment in the population. And yet they work without pay. When I have worked with youth in the juvenile justice system, and I do a module on, reentry, what are you going to do when you get out? Let's make some plans. Let's think about what it is. It's really important. I know that maybe when you get out, you want to go party and hang out with your friends, but let's think a little bit beyond that. All right. Do you have, do you have a resume? Do you know what that is? So, I bring a copy of one. And it's interesting because they never think about, well, I've babysat. Well, that's great. You have some skills. You have some, do you like children, first of all? So if you like working with kids, that's a great skill. Not everyone can do that. So this is something that you can put on your resume. Well, I didn't really get paid. They paid me like $10 or $5, or they said they were going to pay me and they never did. Well, that's fine. It's a skill. And you can build on those skills and you can build on that experience. Relatively speaking, at age 16, 6 months of babysitting somebody else's small children, that's, relatively speaking, that is experience, all right? This is from one of my case studies. So it says, just picking up some firewood for my mom. So here's this young man, posing that he's picking up this tree because, he wants to take some firewood back to his mom. Kids want to contribute. Youth want to contribute to the household economy. That makes them feel grown up. It makes them feel independent. It makes them feel responsible. It makes them feel like adults. And they feel industrious, and they do want to do this. Plus, it's nice to have a little money in their pocket, right? So they can buy the things that they want to buy. They don't have to go and ask, mom, who's probably already stretched thin, for some money. And so youth already have this, this desire, to want to work, to do something. And, generally they'll end up doing things that are not necessarily long-term plans of a career or a profession of choice, but they will do just about anything to be able, to make some money and to be able to contribute, to the household economy, whether it's legal or illicit. So when I talk about traditional workforce, these are the places where, people have a salary, they are able, to take benefits such as, like in El Salvador, you have El Seguro Social, which is, the government subsidized health care because, they pay taxes and whatnot. Women don't generally have that available to them. They tend to work in non-traditional settings and are thereby also not protected because of this type of situation. In a lot of these countries, potential applicants can be asked to submit to a pregnancy test. There generally tends to be, a liability effect the older the applicant is. So 25 is old. If she's married and if she has children, then definitely that's a huge liability. So it's very important, to take these things into account. Because I know that in some settings, it may be difficult to have that conversation about sexual and reproductive health and services, and how, this should be something that you should be ready to have a conversation if one of the youth, comes to you and says, well, where can I get, on the pill, or where can I get condoms, or where can I get services, to make sure, that I can, choose to have children if I want to have children. And that makes a big difference. You have to be comfortable in your own skin to be able to have those conversations. Exploitation and violence. I cannot even begin to tell you. I myself went through this. After the war ended in my country, I was born in El Salvador, and I went back to El Salvador to live there. And I was very young. I spoke English fluently. I had knowledge of computer skills. I mean, I was a very good applicant. And I would go to these job interviews, and I was wondering, how come nobody calls me back? I don't get it. What am I saying? And I actually started asking people, for advice. Like, I don't know. I've applied to these jobs. In fact, some of them, I think I'm even overqualified. And they said, well, what are you wearing? What do you mean? What am I wearing? I'm wearing a business suit. I will dress like this. Oh, see, that's the problem. You're wearing pants. What do pants have to do with anything? Wear a skirt or a dress. You'll see. And so just for the sake of, advancing my own knowledge, I started wearing dresses and skirts. Like, I really did a job. And lo and behold, it made a difference. I started getting callbacks. And I felt incensed that in my own country, it wasn't about what was on my application or my resume. It was about my cows. And, and this is something that actually does happen. And this is me thinking of myself, of being in a position of privilege, by having a skill set that I thought was superior to, say, the general population of women my age back in those days. And so this is something that's very important. It's not until you live it that you that you realize how deeply entrenched this is. High teen pregnancy rates. Over a quarter of mothers in Honduras are under age 18. Think about the implications of trying, to find employment for, a young woman who's still a teenager and she has kids. So it's very important, to think about these things in terms of childcare, in terms of, what kind of support net she will have if she needs to go to work and she can't take the day off because the child is sick, or she needs to take the child, to an appointment. And so this is, where resource building comes in. This is where you got to get to know what's available for folks. I have a friend of mine that works for the Ministry of Health in El Salvador. He's a health promoter. And he talks about how he tries the very best, to accommodate depending on what the family situation is. And by family, I mean whether both parents are at home or if only one parent is there. So he will work, if the mom works and the only time, that he can come in, and check in on this newborn infant is after work hours, he'll do that. He has, the luxury, he calls it a luxury. He has the luxury of working in his own community. So he knows all these people and they all know him. They grew up together. So for him, it's important, to be able to do his job, even if it means having to make some modifications of what the Ministry of Health, has prescribed, is his job. I talked about sexual harassment and violence, which is common in the workplace. When I worked in El Salvador, I actually tried to file a complaint against my employer. And I went to what is the equivalent of, where you go and file complaints about workforce, employment harassment and whatnot. And I was led into this space where there were boxes and boxes and boxes and boxes of complaints that never went anywhere. And I remember the person telling me, you're lucky that he didn't put his hands on you. Because a lot of these complaints, have a physical aspect to it. And it was something, that really stuck with me. I have 2 daughters. I would actually consider it child abuse, to have my daughters raised in a culture like that. Because here in the United States, we take for granted that yes, we have all of these protections, we have all of these rights, we have all of these places that we can turn to. And while some of these, places exist in Central America, there generally isn't a way, to do the follow through or, and there's also the culture that needs, to change, unfortunately. So when you talk about frustration and disappointment, these are some of the things that you're going to find yourself. It's like, how do I change this? And more importantly, how do you help your client, the youth, navigate through those feelings of, there's nothing that I can do about this, and yet I have to go to work in this place where I don't feel safe or I feel threatened. Which then leads me to the next thing. The number of women immigrating from Central America has been increasing. So more and more young children are being left behind. Generally, the profile of the person immigrating from Central America tended to be, young and male. Now we're seeing more women leaving, more kids, as you have seen from the news, leaving. It's almost become a rite of passage that by the time, that you're old enough, you're 15, 16, and you can find your way, out to survive, that's what you do. And so I think it's really important, to think about that and to have a frank conversation with your clients, if that conversation comes up. The reason why, we put together Unfinished Business was because of that. One of the objectives of Unfinished Business was to try to give people some answers, some resources in their homeland, so they wouldn't risk the trip back. If there was a way that they could deal, with their unfinished business in their homeland and not risk, coming back here. So I took this from the classified section of a major Salvadoran newspaper. I didn't have time to do a lot of extensive, researching the classifieds. But here it says, young woman, 15 to 25, for various, tasks, good presentation, call this number. Domestic worker, no older than 25. Cipota, which means kid, or it's a Nahuatl word, for meaning girl, or lady with DUI. DUI, I'm not driving under the influence, but DUI is, the document, the identification document. That likes kids, with or without experience, can leave the house every 15 days. By that, they mean that they want the person to live in the house, and then they can go home and see their family every 15 days. And that's also very important, to take into account, because depending, and I'll get a little bit more into this, if you're working in an urban setting versus a rural setting, if you have, girls coming in from rural areas into the city looking for work, that means, that every 15 days, they get to go home. And they may not even make enough to be able, to go home and come back. So sometimes, they'll just stay in the city and, just, focus on, sending money back home. This one I particularly like. First of all, it's screaming in caps, but I particularly like that it says we do not promote prostitution, because it's very important to point out that they're not promoting prostitutes. And this is something, that is widely acceptable. Cannot be married, must be under age 25, cannot have children. You never see any of this, for any of the advertisements for men. It's not seen as a liability. So, yeah. So it's really important, to know these things when you're working with youth, who will come to you and they will say, well, why should I try to get a job? I mean, look at what is out there available for me. And so this brings me, to stages of adolescent development, in which you're going to get a very, very quick crash course. How many of you work already with youth? All right. How many of you absolutely love it? You see yourself never doing anything else for the rest of your professional life? Yeah, exactly. Working with youth is an acquired taste, very much like French cheese. It really is. Why? Because we tend, to look at youth. Either you love them or you're like, oh my God, why can't they just get it? And it has everything to do with where they're at in their developmental stage. Okay? The frontal lobe of our brain doesn't finish developing until our mid-20s. And that's assuming, that it hasn't, suffered any insults, like a traumatic brain injury or, substance abuse or emotional, insults. So can someone tell me some, characteristics of youth? Be honest now. When I say youth, think of, close your eyes and think of a youth. Don't think of yourself, because you're going to be nice to yourself. Think of the youth, that irritated you on the metro. Yeah, you're all laughing. Think of the youth, that you saw someplace in a public space, and what did you think? Yes. Lack of spatial awareness. Great. What else? Yes. Peer driven. That's great. What else? Loud. I heard something? Yes. They need more sleep, right? And I have a slide about that, which has everything to do with that. So this will be available to you, but the point, that I want, to focus on particularly is social emotional development. They challenge us adults. And particularly, I have found that when I work with girls, I get a different type of pushback than I get with boys. Particularly if the girl has had, some issues with her own mother. And here I am, a woman that's probably like in her mother's age range. And so all of a sudden, she's projecting whatever issues she has with her own mother onto me. And it's something, that as a therapist, it took me a while, to figure out, how do I navigate around this, maintain the relationship, but at the same time, keep the boundaries of what the work is here. And, not always can you put it on Front Street and say, see, it's right there. They won't always see it. So it's very important, to be aware of your own issues as well, of your own biases, of your own experiences, and how they will play out in your work experience. So they have a great interest in privacy. Sometimes, you'll find, at least I have found, some kids will just open the floodgates and they will tell you too much information. I'm already thinking, am I going to be liable for any of this if I have to be summoned in court? Some of them, it'll take a long time for them to open up and tell you something. But when they do, you've known that you've made a breakthrough, because now they trust you. And now you have something that really says, we have now started a relationship here where we can work together. And of course, there's also the different age breakdown. which is really important. The older the youth, you have different expectations, particularly when it comes to a sense of identity. Okay, those of you that remember your days back in high school, the cliques, there were the jocks, there were the goths, there were the skaters, you will see that as well. And when working with youth, someone mentioned about peer influence. If you got one kid coming in and they look around and they see people that are on the other end of their peer identity, they're going to probably either want to come back with a friend they feel comfortable with, or they're not going to want to come back at all. So sometimes even scheduling things is very important. And I always tell youth, bring a friend, bring 3, I don't care, bring them. Which of course then opens up to some other logistical nightmares, because if they bring too many, and then you're in trouble. So it's important to keep these things in mind. Also, like 2-year-olds, adolescents tend to be victims of homicide by people that they know. Why is that? What's unique about 2-year-olds? What's their favorite word? No. The terrible twos, right? The terrible twos really are about, I now know how to walk, and now I know how to say a word. I am the master of my universe, and you are just my pawn. And so adolescents also have a little bit of that attitude that drives people crazy, which is one of the reasons why, when looking at 0 to 18, 2-year-olds and teenagers tend to be murdered by people that they know. So it's very important, to keep that in mind, because it can get under, people's skin. And it's very different, when working, with an adolescent, who constantly challenges you, may even be disrespectful. And, that's something, that goes to talking about expectations early on and nipping things quick in the bud, setting that boundary clear. The only way we're going to work through this together is if we respect each other. And it's very important, because for some youth, this may be the very first time an adult has actually put that out there for them. Like, I will treat you like an adult if you treat me like an adult, and we can respect each other. So some youth, may have a little bit of a hard time, navigating through that. I want to talk a little bit about call centers, because they seem to be all the craze in Central America right now. So securing employment is just the beginning. There's also what's going to happen once you get a job. You can open up a bank account, managing your personal finances, managing personal versus family finances. It's also really important, that you talk about things, like benefits, rights and responsibilities. Even though laws are existing in these countries, that protect employees, they're not always enforced. And oftentimes there may be a situation, where a person that complains can be blacklisted. And particularly the call centers, they have a very tight network. They work with each other. And if someone gave a problem, at one call center, they may be prevented from securing employment at another call center. This is actually something that does happen. Exploitation occurs at every level. There's apprenticeship programs, where people are promised pay and they're not paid. Unpaid training, contractual work, loss of wages, discrimination. And that particularly applies, to LGBTQ youth and girls. So I'm going to talk about what works. This young man is doing his homework, while selling candy and other things. So these are some examples of what youth have told me that works. Okay. So target opportunities that focus on resources and location. Again, what I was talking about, urban versus rural. This is a group of youth that are doing an apprenticeship at the National School for Forestry in Honduras. So they live in the middle of Honduras, not close, to any urban settings. They're literally right in the middle between Tegucigalpa and San Pedro Sula. And so this is something, that they're getting, a stipend. Some of them are getting an opportunity through a scholarship. I apologize, for one of the young men in the picture. Live for social skills training is part of an integral approach, which is why I'm saying, and developing a work ethic, showing up on time. Well, I'm not in the mood, I'm tired, I didn't sleep. Or, I went out with my friends. You have a work ethic, you have a responsibility. Just like you have an expectation of your employer paying you, your employer has an expectation of you showing up on time. So you got to get up, dress up, and show up. Conflict resolution. You don't deal with coworkers the way that you deal with your friends out in the soccer field. You can't punch people when you're mad at them. And your boss, yes, he may be annoying, but still does not give you the right, to do things to his car. Financial literacy programs that provide interactive real-life learning experiences. One that I particularly like that I use with girls in the juvenile justice system is with an organization called Independent Means. I'll show you the website later, but independentmeans.com. They have a game that you can use. It's in English though. But some of the activities that they use, they're based on real life experiences, managing money, managing a personal budget. So they don't find themselves getting frustrated if they've run out of money because the first paycheck they splurged it on, I don't know, going out with their friends to the beach. Entrepreneurship programs that provide skills training, mentorship, and seed funding. One thing is to provide skills. A whole other thing is like, great, you have this wonderful idea, and good luck with finding a way to make that happen. Financial assistance to pursue vocational professional goals. Unlike the United States, a lot of these countries don't have the FAFSA or financial aid or ways, for people to be able to go on a career path. And education is a great privilege. Focus on resiliency and the outcome instead of risk factors. So, you're living in a gang-infested neighborhood, and your dad's in prison, and your mom. If you focus on all the negatives, the kids already know this. They know they've got a lot working against them. But if you can focus, on something that talks about, let's see what kind of an outcome do you see coming out of this, whether it's 6 months, and you got to think, relatively speaking, when you talk about a year, that's a long time in adolescent, in the adolescent universe. Strategies on how to meet biopsychosocial needs that youth may present. So, you treat them with dignity. If your baseline is always going to be treating them with dignity, let me tell you, you will probably get a lot further than just focusing on the outcome. Which also comes, to what we can say is, charity having a negative effect. Kids don't want a handout because it makes them feel little again. It makes them feel dependent again. They want to earn something. They want to work for something. So giving them something is not going to work for them necessarily. Transactional societies and criminal activities that may be viewed as more dignified and easily accessible. How many of you saw the movie Goodfellas? Okay, without spoiling it too much, there's a scene in there where his wife, he's a mobster then turned informant. It's based on a true story. His wife talks about how she felt proud that she was married to a mobster because he went out of his way, to suck it to the man. And so that's a mentality that you're going to encounter. Like, being an halcón, being a lookout, for the cartels is a good way to make some money because there's nothing else for me to do. And begging for money or, doing something, demeaning that's going to embarrass my family, no, I'd rather do this. This is cooler, and it's more dignified. So you're going to have to, think about how to navigate that conversation. So more of what doesn't work. I'm a big advocate of sexual and reproductive health. You don't want to go someplace that says STD clinic. You want to call it something else so people find it more approachable. Same thing, with youth employment programs or anything having to do with violence reduction. Call it something, that the youth perhaps even come up themselves or the community comes up themselves. Also, check in with yourself as to how you feel. If you feel that going to work makes you feel unsafe, it makes you feel like, I can't do this. Think about how they feel, okay? Think about how they feel. And so it's really important, to take those things into consideration. So we're talking about, the not wanting to get up early in the morning. So this is the meme about how, the school day is divided into 2 shifts, the morning shift and the afternoon shifts. And I've heard over and over from youth how they rather, especially the ones that are not gang involved, they would rather take care of things early in the morning because of the gangsters are sleeping. And I've heard this, even from young children all the way to college students. So the later the day, it's like vampires. The later the day, the more scared they're, to go out. So in terms of like setting up activities, set them up early. And also, don't forget about the afternoon youth or the late shift youth. Because as someone said, developmentally, they tend to wake up later. Just try to find being creative of addressing their needs, while, keeping their safety in mind. So just going to go through these, speeding through. This is a young man who is learning forestry in Honduras. And he was telling me that he really enjoys it. He's close to home. He's learning, a trade that will help, keep his country's forests beautiful. He says, what works for me is to be given the chance to do something I like, not what my father wants me to be, which is why for a while I was running with the wrong crowd. This young man, had already been recruited to be a lookout. For those of you familiar with Honduras, the cartels are pretty much, deep in business there. And so they look to kids and youth, to do, some of their daily work, for a very low fee. This young man is a university student, and he said, what works for me is to receive financial assistance so I can finish my university studies. He has some great ideas, for setting up his own business, but there's no seed money. There's no one, that can actually help, take it to that next level. And it would be great, if someone could teach him, how to do a business plan, but, who is he going to show it to? He lives in one of the most dangerous communities in El Salvador. No one's going to want to finance that. So these are some things, that, you also have to take into consideration. And last but not least, I left, the example of a woman last, because one thing that I have noticed that it takes longer for women to get to a place where they are not in a violent environment, whether in their own home or in their own community, but also in a place where they feel more financially independent. I presented last year at the State Department, and we talked about girls and women in gangs. And somebody asked, "So are you saying, that we shouldn't, give, do these microloan programs, or that we shouldn't, give money to women?" And I said, "That's not what I'm saying at all. I'm just saying you have to couple it with other things to be sure that once a woman is on the way of becoming financially independent, she has a way to get out of that relationship, or she has a way to find a safe place and continue becoming financially independent." And that's something that over the trajectory of the life of girls and women in these countries, I've noticed that it takes them a little bit longer to be able to get that. And she found it by becoming someone who also oversees other people's safety. So there's my contact information and some references. I put the chickens in the coop because, it's the Central American version of LinkedIn.
Well, fascinating. Two very rich, thought-provoking presentations. I'll be looking for your questions and comments in just one moment. I think we'll take 3 questions from this room, and then we probably will get some coming in from the webinar as well. While you're thinking about your questions, I just want to comment that some of you will have to leave at 3:30, so we'll take a quick pause and allow some of you to leave. We do have the room until 4, and I think we probably have enough interest to continue here and have the discussion continue until 4 o'clock. So with that, any questions or comments for our presenters? Number 1, number 2, number 3. Please. There's a microphone coming to you now.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Steve Senna with the World Computer Exchange. Thank you for those great presentations. I have a question, I guess, for both of you. I'm curious about this Chicago program, or in general in the U.S. I'm curious who funds that, and you both were public defenders, right? Is that correct? Oh, you worked, okay. So I'm wondering the institutional context in Central America, and I guess extending to Latin America. I had experience in Peru, it was a long time ago, but I was shocked that, for example, the police were national. And so I'm just curious how that, you work very closely with local law enforcement. I recall in Peru, they typically would send police officers to somewhere far away because they didn't want them to be close to people they knew and things like that. I mean, this may have changed, but I'm just curious on an institutional level for funding. I don't know if you got, for example, Department of Justice grants and things like that. and how that institutional context from the U.S. might overlay into Central America and Latin America that are still pretty centralized. But this all sounds like it has to happen at a very local level. No, okay, good. I look forward to hearing from it.
So on the Chicago, that was funded by, there was a, the Department of Family Services, Commissioner Evelyn Diaz, I believe, was the one that was responsible for putting aside money to do this for a cohort and doing it as a randomized controlled trial, which is oftentimes, you know, that's the gold standard in research of how you can see effectiveness and impact. And so this one was done. The cohort was given mentorship and a job. It was about 20 hours a week, minimum wage for youth for the 8 weeks of the summer. The second cohort included both the job and also some, you know, cognitive behavioral therapy type interventions in addition to so it was less hours of working, but they supplemented the same number of hours and were being paid the same amount, but were given the sort of additional skills trainings and interview skills, the soft skills, right? And then the other was not given any treatment at all. It was the control group. And so the first two cohorts, they had exactly, very, very, very similar, almost exactly the same reductions in violence. So, and it was a quite almost about 46%, I think, but close to 50% reductions in violent arrests. And the really promising thing was that a lot of people thought that may have affected just during the period of the intervention, so that they were, you know, they were not on the street, not up to anything because they were being contained in some kind of job situation, but it actually extended for about 16 months afterwards. So very promising in that regard. That was, so it was funded by the City of Chicago. It was evaluated by the University of Chicago Crime Lab, who is largely funded by the MacArthur Foundation. So I'm sure they had something to do with that evaluation. And it does have, you know, really promising results. But it was interesting that everyone's been talking a lot about how CBT is a way of engaging and finding solutions, and in fact, that they were exactly the same whether or not you had the CBT added to it or you just had the job. So that was interesting. And in terms of, I think your question, so yes, we work community. Yeah, we work very closely with law enforcement in all of the communities that we work with, and it is local. I mean, you have to have buy-in and engagement from law enforcement locally, and you need, you know, ideally the commitment from the administration and civil government. And that's one of the big challenges and something that we have been thinking about, exploring and researching in our ways. How and what does this look like in places that do not have institutional support in the same way, right? It is going to be different. The issues of rule of law certainly will be a challenge. I don't know that they're you can't overcome them. One of the really useful elements of the work that we do is you don't need that much to get it done in terms of the people, because again, you're focusing on small numbers of people and very, very specific ways. So we always tell people you can use the existing resources that you have. Usually, you just have to deploy them differently. Right, we don't want to send, you know, massive numbers of law enforcement into communities after shootings and arrest everybody and their grandmother essentially for a shooting that took place, which has now caused huge problems in our communities. Particularly, everyone has seen what has happened over the last, you know, it's really come to the front with Ferguson and similar situations of how damaged those relationships are. So trying to figure out ways to control violence and doing it in the most strategic way. We say like laser-like, so, you know, very much a go after the exact people that you need to in the exact way. But in situations where you don't even have that much capacity. You don't need that much if you're only doing it in the very strategic way. But it is a very important question to think about in terms of what that looks like. And it is something that we are, kind of tackling in various ways. But in the end, I'll also say the part that we keep trying to remind people is, while law enforcement is a critical component of what we do, at the end of the day, a lot of what we find is that the community needs to set the standard of what is acceptable in those, and that is part of how you get there, right? Is that if the community is they're not safe just because of law enforcement. They're safe in part because of what is acceptable in that community. And so it's really mobilizing the community in a way to help set that standard.
Okay.
Great. Thank you. My name is Mike McCabe with Creative Associates. And I was curious about two aspects that I didn't hear touched on that much. One is the role of the private sector in this and how they're engaged, as well as how they contribute through redlining. One of the issues, I was our chief of party in Panama for the Youth at Risk program, and in our programs in El Salvador and Honduras, we run into this a lot, that young people we work with are, because of the neighborhoods they're in, are redlined away from formal sector jobs. And so how do we work with the private sector and the public sector to figure out ways that both in primary and secondary level prevention interventions around employment, we can engage the private sector effectively? So we were able to do that, but it took a lot of effort to get specific companies to buy in to want to employ some of these. And then you have the tattoo laws and other things that complicate. The second piece is on recidivism. And I think you all did a great job of highlighting the importance of kind of micro-targeting here. Are we looking at kind of primary level prevention, or young people who are coming back out of adolescent detention facility? And so as they come out, immediately one of their challenges is where they live, how they can establish, as you were talking about, an address, in a way that they can access opportunities for employment. So if you could talk a little bit about that, because as Father Greg Boyle talks about, one of the best ways that he's been able to work with them is he goes to the prison first and works with them there to build the trust. And when they come out, they have someone that they trust to get back into some of these services and that path. So.
Redlining and recidivism.
Okay. So in terms of, we don't do a lot with the for-profit community or the businesses. I will say that it comes up in very specific ways when we are trying to get in a broad support for like the coalition side of things, right? And one of the ways that has really been, we see business coming to the table is usually in the results, right? So when we go to our city, we have consistently seen between about a 25 and 50% reduction in homicides and shootings in group and gang involved. And when that starts to happen, the business community gets very excited because they see opportunities to invest, and economic development can start to take off. And that has been the way that we have most closely have worked with the business community. There are lots of cities in which individual businesses have raised their hand and said, I'm willing to take individuals with criminal records, and people that have open cases. We're not going to do background checks, and there's a great movement in some ways right now in the United States to really push on a lot of that. And not being negative, but we have one city where we had that, right? We had a guy who owned a business and said, I'll give every single one of your guys a job. And he did. And not one single person was still employed after a year. So I think that there is, it's a lot to ask community to take chances on people that are not ready for that and to set them up for that. So we usually work very closely when we have the community members that are business owners. We work in kind of very specific ways to have them represent the community in ways that we think are important, because they speak they speak for the community and they can set the standard. They can also stand in partnership with law enforcement, which doesn't happen, certainly not in the United States right now. There is so much of a divide that having, we have a city in which one of the speakers at a call-in is the man who owns the funeral parlor in that community, and he stands up there and talks about how hard this is for him to continue, even though this is his business. Like, I'm the one that has to tell your mom to come up with $5,000 she doesn't have, and so we don't really engage in probably the way that you're talking about. And in terms of recidivism, we don't really deal that much with reentry, although there are some really promising programs out there. The people that we're working with are the people that are generally core offending and not looking, but certainly there is evidence to show that working right immediately on their release is probably your best shot, and trying to get that transition as best you can. I mean, there's some new things that are happening inside prisons that will kind of connect to our work, in fact, but trying to sort of set these same messages inside as they transition out. And there's some investment on our end to try to look at what role having people come back from prison plays in the violence that happens there, because somebody who's been gone a while comes back and stirs up a lot of the action and like what you can do about that. But I can't really answer your question per se about that.
I think one example that I found was this man that I met at 2 different conferences, and we actually spoke together on a panel. He owns a rum distillery in Venezuela, and the name of his project is Proyecto Alcatraz. But he has the luxury of owning this business and making these decisions. And this is something that we need to keep in mind, when we approach the business or the private sector. They make these decisions, and so we pretty much have to go in, with a mentality. It's like, how do I make this a win-win for the both of us? Because they don't see a win for themselves. Perhaps at the very least, there won't be any graffiti in your establishments. The gang members won't extort your drivers when they're delivering product. I mean, it may, but this, of course, then entails, something that a lot of people are not comfortable with doing, which is working with the gangs themselves. And so it's very important, so I'll put that in the back burner so as not to stir up more controversy. What I also have found works is particularly with women who already are doing something. Maybe, they're sewing clothes from home because they can't work outside of the home. Maybe they're making tortillas from home. Maybe, they're cooking food and delivering, to people that are too scared or too tired or too sick, kind of like Meals on Wheels. And I have found, that when you get them to a place where they can take that business, which is making just enough to survive, to, meet, their own needs, if they can take, if they can get some sort of, boost or a push, to get it to the next level, it is very, very useful to them. And some people, may argue, there was a project in El Salvador, with the chicken coops, where they, this was in Ilopango. And I heard in a presentation, they say, yeah, but the problem is it really wasn't making a profit. It was only benefiting the gang member and his family. Well, call me crazy, but I would rather have the gang member and his family benefiting, from a legal business rather than him going out there and extorting people or killing people or kidnapping people. All hail the chicken coop. Chicken coops for all the gang members. I don't care. As long as it's something, that they will do, that's productive, that's legal, and, that will provide for themselves. If it's not making a profit, or if it's not meeting, program or project, objectives, we have to learn, to pick our battles with some of this stuff. In Honduras, I helped the family. This was a deported gang member, tattooed from head to toe. Hadn't been in Honduras since he was 10. I mean, this guy was marked for death. Couldn't find a job, no matter what he did. People were scared to death of him. And, his aunt, who was the only family member that would give him a place to live, she would make tortillas. And so he found a way to help her by, going at the crack of dawn, taking the corn, to the molino, to get the corn ground, into the dough. And then she would bring it back, make the tortillas, and that's how she was making a living. he didn't want to be an additional burden. And so he was trying to find a way to help her, by carrying this stuff, for her. You know what kind of an investment would have taken that family to a whole other level? $1,500 to buy a molino. In that village, there was only one. There was only one, and everybody had to use it. And so I sat down with the family, and we talked about, how is it, that we can integrate your new household member in doing things, that maybe you can't do or for whatever reason, but he can do. And it was a $1,500 investment. So when I talk about seed money, I'm not talking about a lot of stuff. And let me tell you, you set them up on a plan, where they can, pay back, $10 a month. Yeah, it may not seem like, a big impact, but it's going to keep that guy, from going and doing other things that are going to hurt other people. And it's helping the family, it's helping him, it's helping the community. And unfortunately, this is basically, it is what it is. That's what's there. Oh, and for reentry, same thing.
Okay, I've got a few questions queued up, but first, yeah, we need to take a short break, let those people who need to leave extract themselves from this crowded room. Good. And after your question, I'm going to ask if there's any webinar. There are some webinar questions, so we'll do those next, and then you. And then that's been 4 men in the room, so I'm only going to take women for a few after that, exercising moderator privilege. No, please stay there. Okay. Good. Thank you for attending. Those of you who had to leave. Exciting seminar, no? Thank you. Good. Okay, question.
Okay, Ezio Castelli with AFSI. Thank you for the presentations. I have a question taken from your Emi.
Can you also tell us your organization or
AFSI, AVSI.
Thank you.
You said that neither enforcement nor social interventions have had a meaningful impact. Instead, sustaining relationship are the single most. Question for you and also for Susan. Do you guess why?
Well, we have been asked things like that many times, and I can only speculate that it requires a very comprehensive, collaborative response, and that there's not one thing that will fix this all. It requires many people working together in partnership to attack both the macro and the very specific issues that are affecting the communities that are most dangerous and most prone to have violence in them. The people that are committing the violence are also the most likely to be the victims of violence. So when we talk about trying to reduce, we don't have, I could answer this in other ways too, which is that people have said we want to stop people from joining gangs. It's kind of how you define that too. Like, we don't talk about gangs, we talk about groups, and we talk about groups and as they relate to violence, because gangs is just a group of people that hang out together, right? It's where the violence is that matters. There's certainly a lot of people that could make strong arguments that fraternities in community are a form of a gang, right? I mean, there's all people say, you hear our clients say all the time, police is a gang. I mean, the idea of getting rid of social cohesion of groups is not going to work, and we know that, right? So let's really refocus this on the violence and then question, how do you reduce violence? Okay, well, here's one way that you can do it through using the group dynamic against it by going against group accountability in the context of the groups that are driving the violence. Then we have the macro issues that are ever present. And if I could tell you, I would love nothing more, having with the sort of 25 years I've spent in various social services, public defender, working for the Legal Aid Society, doing housing and immigration work, all of these, experiences that talk about the underlying root causes of what's going on, education, poverty, and all of these. Nobody has figured out, we've thrown a lot of money at education. That doesn't necessarily work, right? I don't think we have any answers necessarily on what we're going to do about that. That does not mean that we don't keep trying, right? And we find very effective programs that might work in very specific scenarios and want to emulate them. And so we would say probably you got to do it all, but when it comes to the violence work, you need to make sure that you're targeting the interventions to the drivers of the violence and in the communities in which the violence is causing that harm, and also be tackling much more macro the underlying issues that exist in those communities that may be, structural racism, economic opportunities, education, and unfair, the unfairness of the inequities of those communities at the same time. So I can't give you a why, but I could say you need to do it all probably.
So let me see if I understood your question correctly. What you're asking why the relationships are important. Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, to be honest with you, I can't answer that. I'm not the expert on the models. So, but what I can tell you is this: I have worked mainly in most of my life, with youth and families that nobody wants to work with. Okay, I work, with the people that I cannot get funding to do this work full time. And what I will tell you is this: what does work in terms of being able to be effective with them is to really understand what it is that they see as a success. What is it that they want to do? And you know what? Maybe that's not what you want to hear. When I get a 16-year-old tell me that his life goal is to make it up to prison, because for him that's like getting a full ride to an Ivy League. Okay, let's dig a little bit further. Let's look at some alternatives. Let's lay the card, the deck of cards on the table, and let's see what else is in the cards for you maybe. And also remember, you're in charge. You're in control of this. You can get in the driver's seat and really take this. You want to take that car and crash it? That's fine. More power to you. I can't stop you. Only you can. And what I have found, that tends, to work, with some of the very, very, very focused, gang members or people that are very, especially the younger ones. Okay, I tend to work with adolescents. I have no patience for adults. Is that I start by planting, a seed, some cognitive dissonance where I ask them, do you love your homies? Oh yeah, I love my homies. They're my family. I would die for them. I would kill for them. All right, so you love them. Okay, that's good. You know what love is. Okay, do you want to see them hurt? No, are you crazy? I'd kill anybody that would hurt my homies. Do you want to see them die? Do you want to see them in prison? Why would I want that? That's a bad thing. I don't want to see my friends go to prison. I don't want to see them die or get hurt. It hurts me. Then I'm pretty sure your homies want the same thing for you too, right? They don't want to see you die. They don't want to see you go to prison. And so you start this conversation, and let me tell you, some of them, it kind of hits them and it feels uncomfortable because they're like, wait a minute. She's onto something here, or she's trying to trick me. And you keep on coming back to that conversation. So the next time they're not with you in a safe space, sometime when they're in their neighborhood with their fellow gang members, and one of them says, here, hold this. Whether it's drugs or a gun or something, or someone's going to go do something, that person can say, look, man, maybe this isn't such a good idea. Let's think about this. Because you can't be there. It's almost like raising kids. All you can do is expect that what you have taught them, the values that you have instilled in them, and the lessons, that you have hoped have somehow, seeped through into their minds and into their souls that will apply them, when they're out there. So I talk about things like respect. Do you respect, your family, or do you fear them? And by family, I don't just mean mom, dad, biological. I mean the gang. Do you fear your gang or do you respect them? And there's a big difference. And so these conversations, and it really gets, to the nitty-gritty of relationships. You all have to remember, a lot of these youth that are getting into some of these things, even some of the most disturbed, and by all accounts, they're generally the most disturbed, and the ones that are doing the worst things are the minority. But there's a lot of room in between. There's a lot of people in between that are not that, 5% that are committing the murders and doing the heinous crimes. All of those other kids, the 90+%, they've never had serious, in-depth, overtime conversations with an adult that told them, how to process emotions, how to process feelings, how to deal with failure, how to deal with pain. And so this is something, that when I talk about intervention, a relationship, a strong relationship, a healthy relationship is an intervention in of itself. And I know that funders don't want to hear this. How do you fund a relationship?
Well, and let me just plug in one thing quick, and then we'll take some webinar questions, and then you have, I know, queued up a question. But I know that a lot of people, look at workforce development work as, training and technical skills. Then we start learning about soft skills, and then mentorship and career, counseling and these kinds of things. And when you've seen that done well, that's because you actually do create a relationship with the individual in junior high, high school, college, which helps them to find their way through it and, sift through some of the peer pressure and parental pressure they're getting where, they want you to become a doctor, but actually you want to become a hairdresser, right? And so you're finding your way because you find that better information and so on. So I don't think that many of the people coming in this room thought we could actually, get a job for the 150, core people who are, actually committing the murders today, but that through a program of the kinds that people are working on here, that they could, create a stronger community fabric, part of which is jobs, part of which is that better counseling and those relationships that come out of it, that makes that particular favela or pueblo joven or whatever it is a little less of a likely place for the gangs to be growing in 5 years. So I think there's a difference between sort of the macro, we all know Detroit's got a higher crime rate and has lower, higher unemployment. So there is a link in the macro. But you're saying in the micro, it's very hard for us to intervene with jobs. That's not the solution for the hardcore criminals. But I think there's a bit of a prevention element that we're trying to figure out where's the sweet spot for that. And it does involve bringing in these relationships in the end, I think. In any case, okay. So some webinar questions, comments.
Yeah, this is a common question related from Gustavo Payan. Rather than best practices to promote employment or employability, which we've spoken a bit about, it would be great if we could hear the speakers talk about the linkages between employment and crime or violence reduction and or prevention.
As part of this presentation, I was asked, to also think about evidence-based practices, which generally tends, to be a north-south, sort of concept. We take EBPs and we take them, down to someplace else, and then we come to realize it's not an EBP over there. It may be here, but it's not, even within this country. I'm a particular fan of blueprints out of Colorado. For those of you that are familiar with clearinghouses, that look at evidence-based programs or promising practices, and they actually have a way for you to search, different different factors. So I did exactly that. I did violence prevention, youth, and employment, and I think it could only come up with 4, and only one of them was an EBP, I think. And so you could do that too on your own time. You could just Google blueprints Colorado, and you'll see that it's one of those things, that there really isn't an evidence-based practice. And I really urge people, as someone who has worked in research, EBP is a buzzword right now, but please don't think that just because it worked in one locality with one specific population, with one very specific funding stream, with very specific guidelines and outcomes, that you could just take that and plug it in someplace else. And particularly if you try to plug it in someplace else, that has a whole different culture, a whole different environment. The first question, about the centralized versus localized, El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras have over 200 municipalities in each country. So yes, there's a very strong central government, but each municipality, El Salvador has 262. Each municipality is a world unto itself. So the central government can say something, but ultimately, the mayor of that municipality is going to do whatever he or she wants. And so it's very important, to think about these nuances. Anything involving, you're going to do this way, people are going to look at it and they're going to, this is not going to work here because they don't know what life is like here. Even as a Salvadoran, I get my own family and friends that still live day to day in El Salvador. They tell me that I don't get it because I don't live there. And you know what? They're right. Okay? So I don't try to assume, that I have answers for them because I don't live it in the flesh and blood like they do.
Thank you. You had your hand up for a long time, then the web, then you.
Mostly connecting with Gustavo's question on the web. And I think the problem it's how we align employment and violence. My name is Enrique Betancourt. I run the crime prevention initiative at Chemonics, but I'm the former director of the National Center for Crime Prevention in Mexico. And we thrive, obviously, with employment and with education and all this programming on the ground. The problem is that we tend to think that the root causes of the problem are symmetrical to the solutions. And the truth is that that's not true. When you don't bring services to someone at the right time, the right moment, you end up having people with trouble, right? So the interventions is the question is: do you approach this from a tree problem or from a theory of change? If you approach it from a tree problem, obviously employment is strongly connected to violence. But if you want to solve the problem, it's not employment the one you have before reducing violence. You have to reduce the violence so you can get to better conditions for employment. And I think this is key because it doesn't matter how hard we try in these communities. And I would support some of the numbers that Amy showed hold true in Mexico. They hold true in El Salvador, in Guatemala, in Honduras. The concentration is super high. A kid, just a young man living in Ciudad Juarez is living under 500 homicides per 100,000 rate, whereas in Mexico the rate is 20, right? So if you try to work on those environments, let's imagine just a community where everybody is living under above 1,000 homicides per 100,000, and try to bring services to those places. Nothing that you try there is gonna really work in terms of education, employment. So if you don't work with that 5%, it doesn't matter what you do with the 95%. Those investments will eventually, I guess, be like super diminished.
Thank you. That was a great comment. Since it was a comment, let's go to the next question from the web.
Sure. This is a comment from Miguel Moreno. We've spoken a bit about public-private partnerships, but in my experience, a holistic approach to workforce development requires dialogue between public, private, and educational institutions. In order to have a decent quality education program, a demand analysis is needed to customize training and mobilize resources. Internships or practicum programs are very effective to promote transition to formal employment. How do you see the gap between employment and skill sets of youth?
Did you catch that, or because actually, I think we should just give a quick hand for Susan, who has she doesn't want to be arrested for double parking her car. Great.
So again, final question is: how do you see the gap between employment and skill sets of youth?
And if you're not comfortable with it, I think we have a few people in the room who might be willing to take on that one. Would you be willing to answer that one? I think. Repeat the question a third time, we might get it. It's a good one.
The gap between employment and skill sets of youth.
Let's move on. More questions.
I have one more here from Melissa Johnson. Clearly, sustained relationships and sustained availability of services are critical, yet programs and projects struggle with being able to deliver this, especially those that are NGO-based. How do we make the transition to sustainability?
Okay, so how can programs deliver those relationships that we've been saying are so important?
Well, one of the things that sustainability is always an issue, and it comes up in our work as well, because when there's a change in leadership, there's a change in how things are funded, everything can kind of go down the drain, or you have to work very hard at trying to sustain it. I think that the more you set yourself up for having the expectations that you can achieve, the better you can sustain it, because it doesn't, get diluted and spread out in terms of what you're trying to accomplish. People talk about that in terms of nonprofits having like mission creep, right? Well, all kinds of these initiatives can do the same thing, right? Which is one of the successes that we have found, which is to measure everything on the actual violence on the ground. We don't worry about all the other things that could be going on, and sustainability works when you have a very specific target. You are able to meet and measure yourself against that target and can be consistent about that, because if you're constantly changing what it is that you're trying to achieve, it gets lost. Various people come in, they take ownership, they try to move you in different directions, and the more that you are able to say, this is our goal. Our goal is to reduce homicides by X number, or by 20%, 30%, 40%, and they're constantly measuring yourself against that. Then when you have those successes, you can also build on that partnership that you have those successes and make it more built in. Also, I would just say for sustainability, I mentioned this earlier about programs, the more that you can change principles of how you act, the more you're changing the way that the structure is set up, so that when there is a change in either leadership or funding or whatever, the principles are built in there. This is the way that we're going to approach this going forward, so that you can always maintain a consistent goal, as well as the principles that are having you meet that goal.
I don't think we have time for another full round of question and comment, but is there anybody with a kind of a closing comment that they feel should be felt in the room? Was that a hand up or just an? Okay, good. All right. Well, I think this is an extraordinarily complex topic, and there are no easy solutions. But I think there was some nice points about, first of all, what you shouldn't try to look for too many easy solutions, but there is sort of a systems approach that can be used. I like this very much, this idea of don't look for just correlations, but have a causal model that really says, here's the problem I'm trying to solve, and here are the causal relationships that will get me out of that. Just because more education tends to be, or correlate with higher employment, doesn't mean we're going to have higher employment and therefore we're not going to have crime here. It's just once you've lost that opportunity with that group, think about Juarez if you want to think about solving this problem. If you can solve Juarez, you can solve anything. Anyway, this is a fascinating area, and I'm sure we're going to be hearing more on it. Yes.
I started working in Juarez. Juarez is 85% down in homicides today. Employment rates are now.
I started my work there also in Chihuahua City and Juarez 20 years ago, and they were the private sector was terrified about what was happening, and they got together and overcame a lot of boundaries that I see inviolable in other states in Mexico. They had the first non-PRI government, for example, 20 years ago. They overcame those things because they were terrified about what would happen to their children, and they came together, not just as a community, but as a state to really combat it. So, I think that is true. I think there's a lot that the private sector can actually do, partly because they're motivated. This is their community, which is being torn apart. On that note, thank you, everybody, for coming.